I'm very glad to be joined today by human rights activist Vanessa Tsehaye. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I've been wanting to talk for a long time on the podcast now about the events unfolding in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. It's important for the left to be engaged not just with domestic politics, but what's going on all around the world. And now seems like the moment because events are unfolding and unchanging at a rapid rate. I want you to fill us in on what happened with the elections and what's going on right now with the ceasefire. But I want to start by backing up all the way to the beginning for folks who might only have a passing understanding of what's going on. How do we get here with respect to the famine, which has upwards of 350,000 people experiencing food insecurity, hunger? How do we get to this place today?
Well, in November last year, a war broke out by, at the time, the regional government of one region of Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is comprised of several regions. This particular region is in the upmost northern region of Tigray. And federal forces, the Ethiopian federal forces, and the regional forces started a war where allied forces on both sides have been supporting it. And the humanitarian aspect is one that is, of utmost concern for everyone watching, because from the very beginning, that was something that became a concern for everyone. Again, the conflict started early November, and from the beginning, the borders were closed. This was, the region is heavily reliant on trade. This was something that impacted every single person living in the region, not just people who already were poor, but also people who had money and usually were able to buy food from the markets and all of those things. And it's a result of, warring parties that have no concern for the well-being of the people. And this is, more than 8 months on, we see the devastating effects that this has had, with the humanitarian crisis becoming worse and worse for every minute.
So this caught a lot of folks in the West off guard, I've read, in part because Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was perceived to be a kind of Obama-style figure, a kind of new hope, as it were, for the world of African leaders. He won a Nobel Peace Prize last year, was it the year before, and was really perceived to be ushering in a new age of politics in Ethiopia. How do we get from that kind of promise to the situation that he's currently presiding over?
Well, with most new leaders comes new hope, especially the way that Abiy Ahmed rose to power was kind of on the back of protesters that had been protesting in Ethiopia against systemic problems that have been affecting their lives, not just their lives. There were youth mostly leading these protests, but, their ancestors' lives. And I think what happened with Dr. Abiy Ahmed and the way that he was perceived was partly optimism on behalf of world actors who were desperate to see change and desperate to see kind of stability, of course, in the country as well. But if you look at his relationship with, for example, Isaias Afwerki, the president of Eritrea, and the kind of deterioration of a relationship between his former colleagues, he was in government with the TPLF for a very long time. It was, I think, from very early on, you could see that this was not the basis for the beginning of this new hopeful country and this new hopeful government that the world was kind of trying to see. And as an Eritrean and as someone who was following this very closely from the beginning, we did warn against the risks of this new partnership, especially between Isaias Afwerki and Abiy Ahmed, for many reasons. And we were not listened to. So this was not something that people, a lot of us were saying, this is not something that he blindsided anyone with. It was very clear from the beginning. But there were interest and there were desires from people not being affected by this relationship to not criticize that. And that's how we ended up here.
I find that kind of the arguments about federalism and kind of ethnic conflict that are undergirding a lot of this really fascinating, but also really confusing. So if you'll be patient with me, and some listeners that I know are probably also just kind of coming to this green. My understanding is that Ahmed is from an ethnic group called the Oromo, and that for decades, it was actually the people, the Tigray Liberation, the TPLF, that was dominant in Ethiopian politics up until recently, despite being a minority group and the Oromo being a majority group. So the fact of him coming into office was perceived as a kind of rebalance and a majority group that had been previously marginalized being able to, have a voice finally in government. And that understanding it kind of doesn't really gel with one picture of these events, which is that the TPLF are kind of a beleaguered minority group in the north that are now kind of objecting to Abiy and his government. So can you help us unpack how we got to this place where Ahmed became, in some people's minds, the kind of aggressor against this minority group that used to, in fact, be in power? And is it right to think of him as an Oromo as being kind of offering that kind of rebalance of power, or is he continuing the kind of majoritarian, the status quo of the government that he took over from?
No, I mean, Ethiopia is extremely complicated, and even within that complexion, there's even more complexion as you dig deeper. So, Ethiopia is comprised of several ethnic groups, but we tend to focus on the biggest ones, or the ones that have been more presented throughout history and more represented. So, of course, we have the Oromos, which is the biggest, and then we have the Amharas. We have people from the Tigray regions who are Tigrayans. And there are several other ethnic groups as well. So in terms of that, yes, it's complicated. It's not just about a minority that ran the country and then has been kind of relegated, and then the majority is taking over. When Abiy Ahmed rose to power, he was appointed by the TPLF from within the coalition party government. So if we go even further back, Ethiopia back in the 70s, even earlier on in the 60s, was facing insurgency from several ethnic groups because of how the country had been run for centuries. And Eritreans were one of that group. So Eritreans had been kind of taken over by Ethiopia against their will and were rising up to gain independence. The Tigrayans were rising up to gain more recognition and power. The Oromos were rising up to get more recognition and power. The Somalis that also are part of the Ogaden region, historically a part of the greater Somalia, or what historians like to call it, were also rising up. So at the time, they were facing different kind of insurgencies. And this was because the country had been run predominantly by one ethnic group, and that was the Amharas. So this is a different ethnic group that isn't as discussed in the current conflict. And as we move towards the 90s, and these groups are getting more stronger, and eventually 1991, independence comes for Eritrea, and TPLF gains power in Ethiopia and decides to form a coalition government comprised of different ethnic groups from different ethnic groups, but discussions were held about how representative these actually were and how much this actually represented the interest of the people of those regions. So federalism was started in 1991 in Ethiopia, but then there were, of course, conversations about how representative and how just the system actually was, and how they were being treated. And as we saw for almost 30 years of TPLF's rule, there were massive problems. Amnesty International's documented throughout that period human rights violations affecting all different groups and peoples in Ethiopia. And it's not a binary of the good and the bad, the majority against the minority, in the same way that it has been portrayed from both sides. And even now, there's conversations about TPLF as these rebels or as a terrorist organization, when TPLF was the ruling government for almost 30 years. And Abiy Ahmed and many of his colleagues now in government were part of that ruling coalition and were part of many of the decisions that were made during that time that they're now accusing them of being responsible for, and kind of justifying this invasion with partly, not solely, but partly. So there's all these dynamics. And so when some of these policies then during this 30-year period of TPLF's rule were affecting the Oromo population in different ways. There were land issues, there were suppressions of protesters and journalists and all these different issues. And they were protesting. A lot of it was also about economics. People were poor and wanted jobs, but a lot of it was also kind of directly because of who they were. And so in that period, they were protesting, and after a while it got too much, so they decided to appoint Abiy Ahmed, as you say, because of his background. That doesn't mean that Abiy Ahmed, and this applies to any race, any ethnicity, anything, doesn't necessarily mean that he then will represent the the kind of needs of that people. And we saw early on, there was hope from people within Ethiopia, from Oromos, from different ethnic groups, from people from outside, seeing this new man come to power. But it was also met with a lot of disappointment very quickly after that. And we could see, a year on from the murder of the killing of Hachalu Hundessa, which is this famous massive artist and activist, and the security response from the government, and also just before that as well in the Oromia region and after, has been detrimental. And that's again something that organizations have been documenting for a long time. So it's not as clear, it's not as kind of simple that he came from this ethnic group and now they are in power, and that's why TPLF is upset because they want. It's a bit more complex than that. And you can see as well that he's been getting support from the Amhara special region. And it's been something that they have been supporting, the group that I mentioned earlier on as well. So there's a lot of dynamics happening and not a lot of clear answers, unfortunately.
So we have this Obama-esque figure who kind of earned that reputation in part by, seeming to have peaceful negotiations with Eritrea and bringing peace to the region and letting journalists and other political dissidents out of jail at first. And then you have the murder of this very famous musician, this artist, and a kind of walking back of some of the kind of liberal policies, for lack of a better word, that he had implemented. And is that when people started to perceive him differently? Is that an accurate assessment of this trajectory last summer into last fall?
I think it's definitely started before. A lot of the kind of violations that we had documented, at least, were definitely started before. It was a deteriorating process. It was a honeymoon period, not just for, I think, for the country, for Ethiopia, but I mean, for some people in Ethiopia, but also for the world. So for a long time, 2018 up until 2019, there was this kind of whitewashing and hopeful energy being perceived around Abiy Ahmed's personality. And I think it took a while, even when the first journalists started getting detained, or when, this internet started getting, all these smaller things would happen, and people tried to not to look at it because you don't want to see that. You want to feel hope. You want to feel that there's going to be change in a country like Ethiopia, such important strategically from many countries as well in the region. You want to see stability. So I think there was some, I don't know how much of it was ignorant, but there was definitely some optimism and hope that continued for quite a long time. But I would say that summer last year was definitely a turning point for many people, and definitely the media as well started then, I think, perceiving the situation differently. But if you look at when the war started, I don't remember how many articles that I saw that said, how did we get here? How did this Nobel Peace Prize winner kind of turn around? How could we miss this? And of course, a lot of us were then saying there was nothing that was missed. We warned, we spoke in the media, we spoke at political meetings, at international organizations, we lobbied, and our voices weren't heard. So, and that's a different conversation of why that was.
Well, I'm curious, to what do you attribute that kind of Western blindness as to what was really going on?
I mean, if you look at Eritrea, for example, which is a country I've worked on for a very long time, it's a country that it's not a priority country for anyone. It's not something that anyone will fight for to get on the agenda at the Human Rights Council or at the Security Council, despite the millions of people who've been suffering there since 1991 or even, beyond. And after Ethiopia and Eritrea they regained the relationships when Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki, as I always say, became friends, because they didn't just regain relationships, they became good friends in the eyes of everyone. That then Eritrea started being seen as this country in transition, this country that was moving from authoritarianism or from dictatorship to now to hopeful days. Eritrea had justified their 30 years of repression using a conflict with the TPLF. And they had argued that the detention of journalists, of politicians, the shutdown of the free press, the failure to implement the constitution, the implementation of an indefinite national service that has been described as slavery by the United Nations was all done because of the conflict between the TPLF and the Eritrean government. And so when Abiy Ahmed rose to power and Ethiopia and Eritrea then became friends, Eritrea and TPLF had still not fixed their relationship. So they were still extremely hostile. And the border that had been kind of, the border has still not been demarcated. And this was the root of the conflict. This was why for 30 years or for 20 years, Eritrea and Ethiopia had been at a no war, no peace situation. There was an active war, but the border was still marcated. And despite friendship between Ethiopia and Eritrea, despite the normalization of relationship, this border was still marcated. And we were saying there's clearly not peace in the region. There's clearly still hostilities between the fighting parties. It's just that the fighting party on one side has lost power. And now the Ethiopian government is able to regain this relationship with Eritrea. And so once that relationship was regained, the kind of apathy against Eritrea, before we could, of course, push for stuff, we were able to push for a special rapporteur on Eritrea, a commission of inquiry, because it wasn't a country of interest, so no one was really going to go against that too much. But once the relationship between the two countries improved and became good, we could see resistance and this idea that the Eritrean government was going to change and the repression in the country was going to end. And this stems from the good relationship with Ethiopia and the powerful influence that they have in the region and also beyond. They kind of set the agenda on how issues in the region are perceived, how the response is from international institutions are given. And this impacts the lives of the people living there. And it's interesting how the support of human rights movements, both in Tigray, in Eritrea, but also across Ethiopia, has been sometimes viewed as like an imperial project that we're here kind of implementing or imposing rights on people, on subjects, when in fact the situation that is existing there is a result of Western silence and Western complicity.
Yeah, that's interesting because I have seen some tensions emerging on the internet, even among kind of a broader left community, where some folks, I saw Jamu Baraka, who was, a lot of people will know him as Jill Stein's running mate in 2016, saying that any intervention was kind of an imperialist project and that the West basically should stay out of it, despite the humanitarian issues in the area that one might say demand some kind of intervention. And a lot of folks, I believe yourself included, push back against that idea. And it's difficult because if I were to make a general rule about the habits and behaviors of America and whether I would trust an intervention on humanitarian grounds to be based in good faith, I would say probably not. But there are obviously times when it's warranted. How do you understand this moment? And are you concerned about kind of bad faith reasons why the West might choose to get involved in the conflict?
I've been following conversations, of course, from the beginning. I'm the Horn of Africa campaigner for Amnesty International, so I'm working on this 24/7. And I think it's interesting following these conversations, and I think the misconception of what's going on politically right now. There isn't adequate pressure on Ethiopia to act or on any parties of the conflict to abide by some of the very kind of simple requirements that we as a human rights organization and others have put out. The protection of civilians, the protection of property, of equipment, the opening of humanitarian access, stopping the humanitarian organizations from coming in, stop the attacks on humanitarian personnel and their cargo and their food. All these things are very simple demands that we put out, simple laws of war. War have existed since the beginning of time, but there's always been rules within war, and they're being completely violated in this conflict. And the response from the world has been disappointing. Response from African institutions and countries and states has been extremely disappointing, but even the response from Western states and institutions. So I think that there's a misconception of what's going on in Ethiopia. We're not speaking, and when I say we again, as a representative of Amnesty International, but I think also more broadly, the conversation isn't nothing or military intervention. The conversation is, at one point of time, the Ethiopian government refused to allow humanitarian organizations to access the region. That was the situation. We were asking them to open up the borders, allow food, allow medical equipment, allow medicine to come into to the people who are living there. There were almost 100,000 Eritrean refugees who were completely dependent on aid living in Tigray. We were just begging them to open up the borders, and they did. And now we still have up to 1 million people at risk of famine, simply because despite the borders opening up, access is being blocked in different areas of the region by armed parties, including the Eritrean government, including the Eritrean defense forces, including the Ethiopian defense forces. So we're asking for very simple things here, and we're not getting the support we need internationally. We're trying to push for resolutions demanding these things as well, and it's being met with resistance from so many different states. And it's not this idea where the West is dying to jump in, and because of X, Y, and Z reasons. Of course, there's always reasons to why certain states want to get involved, and reasons to why certain states choose not to get involved. But in this situation, that is not what is going on. We're asking for very simple demands. They're not being met, and we'll continue to push, because at the end of the day, our main concern, my main concern as a human being looking at what's happening in Tigray, in Eritrea, or elsewhere in the world, is the protection of people. As long as people need to be protected, and you can cite literature that I absolutely 99% of the time will agree with, but if that literature will convince someone that someone should starve or someone should be continue to be detained because it feeds into this wider idea of what you think is a just world, then maybe that just world isn't something that should exist, because the idea of what that is then is completely altered if people are kind of interchangeable with your ideas. So I think, and it goes back to Eritrea as well, it's been the same argument that has been used, like we can't speak about human rights in Eritrea because that feeds into the neoliberal agenda. But people are conscripted indefinitely. It's literally has been described as slavery. How does that feed into that just world that we're hoping to achieve as a leftist community? It's very disappointing. As a leftist myself, it's extremely disappointing to see how the kind of reactions I've received as well, the kind of comments that I've been receiving for several years now from many members of the American left. It's disheartening, and it makes me question what kind of world they actually are trying to achieve.
Well, I want to get back to this question about why this particular issue and talking about this conflict is so controversial, because I know when I reached out to a friend months ago about talking about this, the advice I got was just be warned. You should do it, but just be warned. Whatever you say, someone's going to be very mad at you on the internet. And I want to get into that by asking you about the initial conflict that set this all off and the two kind of narratives that emerged about who's responsible. But first, I just want to touch on the point you raised about, the combined Ethiopian and Eritrean forces preventing aid, et cetera, to the region. What is the political reason for doing that? What are the ultimate political end goals of both the Ethiopian government and the Eritrean government for blocking humanitarian aid?
That's a very good question that unfortunately I cannot answer. There's speculations, and the community, especially if you follow the conversations online and in the media, of course have their ideas of why that is. Just as someone, again, who's advocating on behalf of the people there, it's hard to speculate to why and assertively say that. But of course, you see the effects it has on the people, and I guess that's enough to be said about, why it's being happening. It's a very deliberate decision. It's not necessary. It's illegal, according to international legal treaties, both that these parties have signed, but also that they're obliged to under as warring parties in a conflict. So it's devastating.
So what is the party line that's coming out of the Ethiopian government as to why this conflict started? Can you walk us through the timeline of the events that happened on our American election day last year?
So essentially what the Ethiopian government has said, and then what has been disputed by the TPLF, and then was again they said it was true, and then now it's being said it's not true. It's very hard to say assertively exactly what happened and why it happened, but essentially there was an attack on a military base up in Tigray, and the Ethiopian government responded by sending in troops. So that was kind of the beginning of the conflict, and then there were conversations about the fact that maybe this wasn't the first step. Maybe it didn't start with this attack. Things were happening before. The TPLF said that they did attack and then they retreated. So it's a bit speculative of what actually happened. And it doesn't really impact the assessment of what's happening on the ground now. It's more about like how the war is being conducted as opposed to how it started. Because wars can start for different reasons, but there's still responsibilities to all parties regardless of who started it.
Yeah, forgive me if this is a clumsy analogy, but what it feels like is the discussion of who started it. It's very reminiscent of the conversations we get about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and any number of moments of enormous overreach, huge death tolls of Palestinians, et cetera, justified by, it's a technicality about who actually threw the first, sometimes, rock. You know what I mean? And it's not that that's not a relevant question, but when I listen to debates happening between people who are representing, Abiy's government and people who are more concentrated on the humanitarian crisis, I do see the who started it question being kind of lobbied as a defense of the current status quo of blocking humanitarian aid and exacerbating the crisis.
Absolutely. And I think, for me, it's a question that I think the first day I was very much thinking about and, trying to understand how this all started, why it started. From day two, the focus is on how the war is being conducted. And I think as a state, especially as a state, but even as just a party of a conflict, equally, but I'm thinking as a state, of course, state obligations are stronger to its citizens and the peoples within the border. It's not a matter of who started it to determine the level of your responsibilities. There are, of course, questions of self-defense that come into play. But almost 9 months on, the question of self-defense, is not proportionate to the violations that we have documented and that we're still putting together and are about to put out more and more reports about what's actually been happening in Tigray in the past, almost 8-9 months. And it has nothing to do with who started and why.
Yeah, I remember I saw the kind of social media flare up. A lot of my perception of what's been going on has weirdly come through these pop culture outlets, as I think Black Americans who have a vague sense of wanting to have solidarity with some abstract struggle are trying to figure out how to offer their support. And I've seen some of the controversy around, what's her face, the comedian?
Tiffany Haddish.
Sorry, yes. Around Tiffany Haddish and saying things on Clubhouse. And I saw the interview with on the Breakfast Club that a lot of people were upset about because the guests were people who were kind of representing the Ethiopian government's point of view. Can you tell us a little bit about that aspect of the conflict and, how, from your perspective, people are misunderstanding where the kind of battle lines are here?
Absolutely. And I think one thing I want to make absolutely clear is that there are complicated situations everywhere in the world. And I think as I'm Swedish, Eritrean. I was born in Sweden. I'm Eritrean, by ethnicity. I still have a good understanding of American politics because we've been indoctrinated since day one to learn about all your states and all your electoral systems and all of those things. So it's easy. It's okay. It was fun to learn about a different country than your own. But that just is when things are happening in America, we understand. We follow your election nights. We sit up all night to watch what's happening, which is why actually I was awake when the conflict even started in November, was because I was following the elections in America. And I think when something happens in Argentina or even in, as you say, in Palestine or in Ethiopia, it's hard for the world to follow what's happening because every single country has a different system, different historical context. And I'm personally very careful before I try to support causes and movements. But I think there's a difference between supporting parties of a conflict or narratives within a conflict or that emerge as a result of conflict or to justify those conflicts and supporting the people that are being impacted by conflict. And I think it takes us to a very weird place when people who are against or support an actor or or against an actor then also start talking about the people being impacted by the actions of those actors as disposable kind of things that has nothing to do with kind of with the issues that they're covering. So to give an example, some of the people who appeared on the Breakfast Club and some of the comments from Tiffany Haddish, if you kind of, what they have in common is that, they're saying that what's happening maybe is bad, but because of X, Y, and Z, we should be careful with how we speak about these issues. And because of X, Y, and Z, these issues maybe are being magnified, and that maybe they're not as bad as we think they are. Or because of X, Y, and Z, we shouldn't be saying anything at all because the actors have to be doing what they want to be doing.
Well, what's the X, Y, and Z? Reason. I mean, like, what is the rationale? Because I've seen a little bit of this. They started it first, and I've seen a little bit of this. Denial of what's going on, genocide denial, a denial that the kind of sexual violence that's been documented isn't actually happening, just generally trying to understate the gravity of the crisis. And then I've seen a little bit of this argument about federalism that I confess that I don't fully understand, but this argument that it's a kind of factionalism that we should not be sympathetic to what's happening in Tigray because it's the result of people who want to have a sort of ethnic factionalism. And help me understand what's going on with these arguments around federalism.
Yeah, so prior to 1991, Ethiopia was not a federal state. It was a country that was run by emperors and leaders that predominantly have been representing or have come from the same ethnic background. And so it was a kind of country where ethnic groups felt like they were being marginalized, and they were being marginalized and had not had political representation, economic representation within the kind of state that had existed as Ethiopia in different forms for centuries. So in 1991, when the TPLF gained power, one of those, TPLF was one of those groups that had been fighting for recognition, for more power. Eritrea was another, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the EPLF, the Ogaden Liberation Front, the Oromo Liberation Front. These were all different groups that had felt that they had been marginalized under the previous system. And so the federal system was created as a way to bridge that gap between the lack of representation and agency within Ethiopia. And how that federal system has worked is a different conversation about, how the TPLF ran the country, how representative the actual system was, how representative the different local governments were in, vis-a-vis the needs of the people, and how the relationship with the TPLF actually looked like. But the federal system in itself and the failure of the federal system is not the kind of the same conversation that you have around the going back to this unitary system of one Ethiopia that has been also discussed a lot. Because the main question that should be asked is, how are the people being represented? How well can a country be represented, individuals within that country, in a space like Ethiopia, where there are millions of people living under very different kind of circumstances, having very different kinds of needs? Is a federal system the best way to respond to that? Or is one unitary government the best way to do so? That, it should be the main question, not how it operated for 30 years to then use as a justification against federalism. Because if a system is being misused, then of course, you can criticize that, but that doesn't mean you should do the complete opposite just because you weren't happy with how it was done for 30 years.
Yeah, that's helpful, because the argument that I saw unfolding in at least one news exchange I watched was that the representative from the Ethiopian government was basically accusing people from Tigray and others, I guess, other groups that are perhaps not adequately represented, at least in their view, in the federal government, of doing a kind of identity politics and wanting to be unnecessarily divisive. And aren't we just one? Can't we be one Ethiopia? And I've seen also people engage in some back and forth about colonialism, and somehow, the kind of famous line about Ethiopia never having been colonized being weaponized in really interesting political ways here, whereas another person might say Ethiopia was colonized, it just was colonized by itself, and all of these groups now are trying to fight for genuine, adequate representation.
Yeah, and I think that's, when you look at the African, nation state and the challenges that every single African country has faced since colonialism and since the kind of the imposition of this political system, you need to look at the issue of representation and to just say, to forget some of these things and to forget some of the differences, but also to forget some of the current, issues that are happening in the country. We have regional governments and local governments in other places as well, beyond Ethiopia and other places, because of how this works. You can look at America; it's a massive country that has different kinds of systems. Not saying that they're perfect by any means, but just you have different ways of responding to kind of local context, and I think taking those things into consideration is important, and also taking the considerations of the people. A lot of times we have these conversations from abroad, but what are people in Ethiopia thinking about this? Do they agree? Do they want a unitary system? Do they want one Ethiopia, or is it just certain groups that want one Ethiopia? Versus other groups that prefer a system where they're being represented in different ways. And I think, the question of identity politics is not the first time I hear it as a Black woman. It's not the first time you probably heard it. Raising issues that your identity faces to then try to remedy them does not mean that you're creating the systems, the problems. There are problems that have existed, and you're trying to see if there's ways that you can kind of remedy them. That doesn't mean that people don't use identity politics as a way to create more problems as well, but just the fact that you're asking for representation shouldn't mean that you should be labeled as someone who's trying to destroy the fabric of the Ethiopian state or the kind of like the Ethiopian country.
So can you tell me a little bit about the advocacy work that your organization is doing?
It's quite interesting because it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, how this is being viewed as like the West is trying to destroy or to go against the will of these African governments, Eritrea and Ethiopia. And it's something that the Ethiopian government has been successfully, kind of this narrative that they've successfully created, is that they are a national government dealing with an internal problem, and the West is trying to interfere to as they always do with African countries and other non-Western countries. When in fact, what we're seeing is very clear violations of human rights that are happening. And instead, this has been weaponized, this idea of like anti-interventionist kind of mentality has been weaponized by the Ethiopian government to then deter actors from getting involved or speaking out in any way out of fear that they will be perceived as like interventionist or that they're going against the will of the African people when we're talking about a few people in power and millions of people in need. And this has been successfully done. You can see at the Security Council, at the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, African states have been extremely hesitant from showing support or getting involved in what's happening in Ethiopia because of the successful kind of execution of this narrative. And it's something that we see, it's not just the idea of it that it's so sad that African countries don't want to get involved. It's having a direct effect on the situation. Advocacy initiatives are being blocked, are being we're spending a million more time on certain things just to get very simple resolutions passed on the conflict. There still hasn't been a single resolution passed at the Human Rights Council. This question has still not been tabled officially at the Security Council, and is one of the worst crises that is happening in the world right now. And it's because of the successful way it's been framed as a national security issue that is being handled by a national government, and then kind of amplified by these theories that we were discussing earlier, that Western states should mind their own business, African solutions for African problems. But when the African Commission actually very brilliantly announced their Commission of Inquiry, that was met with resistance by the Ethiopian government, despite that being literally an African solution. It's an African institution led by African kind of governments, and situated in Africa led by African people. So it's tragic to see how this has been playing out, but I still think there's hope if we can really kind of challenge this narrative and see it for what it is, an excuse to continue operating exactly how they want without impunity or with impunity in their country.
Yeah, I saw this exchange I keep referencing between an Ethiopian government representative, and it was a French scholar who I believe has previously been an ambassador to the region. And the French academic said his piece, and the response was a weird kind of appeal to kind of African independence and pride and anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, to say that your analysis is wrong because you don't believe that Africans can work these kinds of things out by ourselves.
The mistake, I think, and I share that mistake, was to believe that because you belong to a certain ethnic group, every members of that ethnic group walk behind you. But yet there are over 30 million Oromos. So, Mr. Abiy does not represent 30 million Oromos. Actually, he was never elected by anybody. He was picked by a very complex process, basically by the Americans, and basically by Ambassador Yamamoto, and basically because of the Pentecostal connection.
I have to disagree with Gérard Pougnier very fundamentally. It's a very European-centric view to state that Africans cannot choose their leaders. It has to be chosen from someone abroad. I think we Ethiopians have proven throughout our history that we are not that way.
And it was interesting to see that line, which I'm broadly sympathetic with, seemingly being cynically weaponized in that way against what felt like a legitimate critique of what was going on.
Absolutely. And it's heartbreaking, especially like as an African, and the people being impacted are Africans. They're people from the continent. And I always say this as an Eritrean, who's my uncle is a journalist who was detained in 2001, and we haven't seen or heard from him ever since.
Oh, gosh,
he was one of many. This September, it's been exactly 20 years since he disappeared. He was one of many journalists and politicians at the time who were criticizing the government, what was happening, and disappeared as a result of that. And it was immediately after that they shut down the free press. The country descended into what it is now. And so I've been accused by many to be like a Western puppet or, neoliberal kind of activist and all those things because we're operating in the West. And I always say that if we could, first of all, we'd be operating in Eritrea. But second of all, I wouldn't be speaking here. My uncle would be speaking. His colleagues would be speaking. But they have literally been silenced. Like there's no way that they can do so because we don't know where they are. And Eritrea is now the most censored country in the world where any kind of dissent is met with intimidation, detention or death. So that is the situation that they are operating in. So we are forced to appeal to foreign countries. And that could be African countries if we are able to, but that could also necessarily sometimes be Western countries because of the situation that has been created. So you cannot create a situation where people are desperate and they need help, and the only people they can appeal to happen to be people in the West. It sucks. I can say that with all my heart. As an African, as someone who's, my family participated in the independence war, hoping to achieve, the dream of an Eritrea where people lived a free and dignified life. It sucks. I can say a billion times that we have to do this way, but we've been forced to. And appealing, for example, now with the resolution and everything we're doing to get action on Tigray, the dream is for African countries to lead, African states to be at the forefront of this. But the political system that exists is so that, there are problems because the Ethiopian government has successfully been able to mobilize states in the way that we've been seeing them kind of do so far. And it's why we've been seeing the lack of action. Again, the African Commission's announcement is an incredible step, but the resistance met by the Ethiopian government puts them backwards because now they're unable to operate in the region the same way that they would have if they had had cooperation from the Ethiopian government. And that just shows to say that this is nothing really to do with the West, but it has to do with anyone that opposes what they're doing. And, you can call the African Commission many things, but you cannot call them un-African. They are literally an African institution led by African people. So yeah, it's extremely tragic, and it's been weaponized. And it's the same way you speak about like self-reliance in Eritrea, where you say like Eritrea is the only country in the world that is against Western imperialism, and that's why they're being attacked in the same way that they are. It's not true. Eritrea takes investments from foreign countries and institutions and companies. They take aid from different organizations, institutions, and companies, and they use almost free labor by the people to operate, and then the wealth is hoarded elsewhere. And these arguments are just being used without someone fact-checking them, and people don't really care enough to do the homework to see why these theories are being used and what the reality actually is on the ground. But the impact of the people is being neglected. The impact of this conflict on the people, both in terms of direct attacks by the arming the parties, but also humanitarian assistance, the failure to receive support from these people.
Yeah, I can appreciate, especially given how confusing at least from an outsider perspective, the dynamics here are, or how complex I should say the dynamics here are, wanting to clarify by focusing on what I think you're right is the most important issue, obviously, the humanitarian issues and all of the people who are civilians and not at all involved or responsible who are bearing the brunt of this crisis. At the same time, as someone who's coming from watching it from an outsider perspective and asking questions about what our country's response should be, if anything, and what the international response should be, it does seem to me important to understand on some level who's responsible and who needs to be influenced and pressured in order to stop the humanitarian crisis, in order to allow aid and journalists and everything else into the region. And the most confusing aspect for me is not really understanding what the political benefits are of instigating this kind of a crisis, regardless of who is ultimately decided, to have instigated it in the first place.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as a part of, again, as an activist who's been working on the conflict, whenever we put out, this is happening, we did a massive campaign in February when the borders had been closed. We were identifying this is the actor that's responsible. At that time, it was the Ethiopian federal government. They are legally responsible because of X, Y, and Z. They are the ones who've made the decision to close the borders. They are the ones who have the power to open up the borders. So here's an email action where you can send an email directly to the Prime Minister's office that will pressure them to open up the borders. So there's a clear line of this is what's happening, this is how we can change it. That doesn't obviously mean that the Ethiopian federal government is responsible for everything that's happening within the conflict, or that they should be targeted for every single action or any kind of change that we want to see. And that's a part of the complexity, of course, is that there are many actors that are involved, including foreign actors such as the Eritrean government. But identifying that is important because, as you say, we need to know who's doing what to hold those actors accountable. But that doesn't... You can't backtrack, you can't say, well, they did that because of this and that, because that's not how it works when it comes to international law. And we can change maybe political systems to take into consideration historical wrongdoings, but that would create, I think, a terrible system in where new governments can then do new things because 500 years ago, another government did that to other parts of the group.
Not a kind of historical backdating, but just trying to understand what the contemporary motives are to understand how to change said motives or apply whatever political pressure is necessary to stop people from doing. Do you know what I'm saying? Without understanding
Absolutely.
the incentives in the least. Yeah. And maybe I'm just the only one who doesn't understand the incentives here.
No, I'm completely with you, because I think as what I was trying to say is that within the advocacy within this conflict, at least, because the protection of civilians, the situation is extremely dire. And I don't know if I emphasize this enough in the beginning or throughout, but it's one of the worst crises that I think has affected the region in a very, very long time.
Please unpack that. Please do. I think you're right that we skirted over that a little bit. Can you give us some more detail?
It's not like a thing happening where a few people, there are millions of people in the Tigray region that, first of all, have been disconnected from the world. There's a complete communications blackout currently happening in the region. So we don't even know the exact impact that this conflict has had on the people. The work that we have been doing and other organizations have been doing has been extremely difficult because of the communications blackout, because of restrictions to access the region. But we've been documenting, with the help of, at some points there have been telephone lines that have been opened up. There have been, thousands of people who have fled to Sudan that we've been able to interview. And so we have a good picture of what has been happening, but not a complete picture at all. And I think the most apparent one is, of course, the humanitarian situation. It's the one that is most straightforward. We're up to 1 million people are at risk of famine unless access is granted to all areas of Tigray. And we have seen deliberate kind of decisions from some of these parties from the beginning to impede access to people. And this is very, this is something that has impacted the people, regardless of your, and that's something that was used as well, is that a lot of people who were living in Tigray were poor. And this is something that the regional government had failed to work on. But it was clear from the very beginning that this has nothing to do with pre-existing poverty, but the fact that the routes to Tigray had been completely blocked, that a lot of the farming equipment and the land had been destroyed. And there's, of course, very hard to determine at this stage because of lack of access how and why those equipment and land was destroyed, but this impacted the farming season and the ability for Tigray to at least feed itself until the borders could be opened up. And this is something that is happening. The latest update from the UN was last week, and it said the very same thing. So it's an extremely dire situation. And the reason I said we need to focus on who is responsible right now is because we need to protect the people right now. The people are desperate in support from their allies abroad. Their diaspora is rising up for them because they can't do it within Tigray. There's no way they can join a tweet marathon or call their senators in America or called like pressure on the UN Human Rights Council to act, because they're literally being silenced by this communications blackout and because of the fact that they're in the middle of a war zone. However, with that being said, it's vital to any kind of an understanding of the conflict and any kind of resolution of this conflict as well, to understand why and how we got here, and to understand the dynamics of the different ethnic groups, as you say, the dynamics of the TPLF being in power for that long, what happened during that time, why is the Amhara Special Forces being involved, why has Dr. Abiy Ahmed been receiving so much support from the Amhara region and from the Eritrean government, what does this mean for the conflict, for the region long term. All of these conversations are extremely important. I'm not saying historical context should be disregarded at all, but in the immediate response, and because of the lack of response in the past months, which has been, again, completely misrepresented by some people as if there's like military wagons ready to be dropped in. That's not the case at all. And it's not something that we've been advocated for either. But that should be the immediate focus, is the protection of the people within the wider context. But if that wider context is at the expense of the people, then I think the analysis has been made wrong. But I think both can happen at the same time. No problem at all.
Yeah, I mean, that series of questions you just asked are all questions that I would very much like to know the answer to. But obviously, this is an issue that's not going to be unpacked in in one podcast. And hopefully you and others will come back and continue to have this conversation with us. But I did want to ask you about, you mentioned the elections, these June 21st elections that just passed that were, heralded and anticipated as being one of the first free and fair elections in the country. Can you tell us the role that these elections have played in this conflict and what the update is on them?
Well, the initial, and I think this is something I forgot to mention earlier on as well, is that I think a catalyst for the start of the conflict in November was also the decision by the Tigray regional government to hold local elections, despite the Ethiopian federal government's decision to postpone elections due to COVID.
So do you think that was really interesting to me when I was reading that, because obviously people who are sympathetic with the Ethiopian government said, it's COVID, it's perfectly reasonable to postpone these elections, but there's an argument that was just a subtext to delay them. And it made me reflect on the conversations that were happening here around the same time around postponing the elections, where, Joe Biden's campaign, for instance, came out very strongly about wanting to move forward with the primary, regardless of some public health concerns. Some people argued because he didn't want to give, let his momentum drop. Right. He didn't want to give Bernie Sanders, let's say, an opening there. And that the the rhetoric around the dangers of COVID flipped regardless, depending on whether or not it was politically advantageous. So then you had in the general election, a conversation about, we have to make sure there's mail-in ballots. People shouldn't be compelled to go and get in line, yada, yada, yada. And there's an argument that was pushed because it would benefit Democrats, who are more likely to use mail-in ballots because Donald Trump was telling everybody that the mail-in ballots were fake, blah, 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 blah. So what do you make of that? Do you think that it was a sincere desire to ensure that people were going to be able to safely vote? Or do you think that people who perceive there to be some subtext or a pretext in pushing the date of the election are right?
So, unfortunately, Amnesty International doesn't comment on elections and on the fairness and how free they are. But there's obviously conversations to be held around like how those elections were conducted and the kind of, at the time of the elections, how the opposition parties were treated. And I think even looking at the latest election now in June, there are, the Oromo, one of the main Oromo political parties, for example, several of their leaders have been in detention since last year. One leader is currently under house arrest that we've been advocating for as well. Of course, there were, the entire region of Tigray was not able to participate.
The bigger picture is that Tigrayans decided to go ahead and have elections despite the fact that they were postponed federally. And that was perceived to be a rebuke in some ways, which one may or may not perceive to be a statement on the underlying credibility of the main elections. But so tension around the elections was part of what precipitated the conflict last fall. What has happened last June? Is that okay to talk about?
Well, these elections that were cancelled and that the TPLF was accused of kind of disregarding when they were cancelled last year, and to then hold the elections in November, and then now they were finally held in June. Were held under interesting circumstances, with a part of the country at war, not just Tigray, but there are also other areas of the country that was not able to participate for different reasons. They will participate in November instead, or in September. Sorry. So it was held under very interesting circumstances.
What do you anticipate then could bring an end to the conflict? What kind of either political changes or international pressures? I know that there have been conversations about different kinds of sanctions, et cetera. What do you think are the kinds of interventions, for lack of a better word, that would bring an end to this conflict? I'm
currently hoping there's an African Commission of inquiry that has been started by the African Commission, and we're hoping that this kind of initiative, the fact that there's international and regional eyes on what's happening in Tigray, will lead to the deterrence from actors. I think the main thing what's happening in Tigray, that again I should probably have emphasized more, is that all the actors are acting with a great sense of impunity, that they're not going to be held accountable for what they're doing. Ethiopian federal forces are probably not feeling that pressure from national institutions that they're going to be held accountable. The Eritrean forces are not feeling they're going to be held accountable when they go back to Eritrea. So are the special forces from within the country as well, from the TDF and from the Amhara Special Forces. There's no real sense that they're being watched, so that they're going to be held accountable, which then leads to these extreme violations that we've been seeing. And so a really important aspect of this is the international pressure, eyes on, investigations started, the documentation, from the very beginning, as soon as we can. It's late now. The conflict started in November. We're now in June. No one has accessed, the fact that we still haven't accessed human rights monitors. The investigations have started. There has been some progress for some, but not to the level that we need to see. And that political pressure on actors to stop is not there anymore. Isn't there at all, actually. So what we're hoping to do is continuously mobilize people to apply pressure on our own political actors, to then apply pressure on every single actor involved in this conflict to stop these violations and to prevent more violations from happening, and to bring justice to the victims of past violations as well. But this all begins with political pressure that doesn't exist. And I think our main concern should be informing as many people as possible about what's happening in Tigray, partly, of course, explaining why, but really emphasizing what is happening and what can be done to stop it. And that is, again, political pressure on all actors to immediately stop the violations.
So where can people hear more from you about that, find your work, hear more about your organization's work, and generally keep abreast of developments in the region?
I would, do a self-plug to go to amnesty.org, where we have a page on about what's happening in Ethiopia, overall, but specifically in Tigray. We are setting up, we react to different issues happening. So we are about to launch a massive report on sexual and gender-based violence that has been happening in the context of this conflict, a devastating report, and accompanied with an action that people can take part of, and kind of clear instructions on how people can get involved to deter more of these violations, but also to bring justice to the very many victims that have been affected. So there are ways that people can get involved by going to amnesty.org, and of course by following our accounts on social media. There are several accounts that, if you go to my account, for example, Vanessa Tsehaye, that you can see that I retweet and that we share, that are updating regularly from what's happening in the region, and with different kind of actions, social media campaigns, and petitions that people can take to be a part of the change that we're hoping to see in the region.
All right. Thank you for that. We'll put your contact information in the bio. Before we close out, I'd be remiss not to ask you about the ceasefire. The recent ceasefire, described as a one-sided ceasefire, the Tigrayans having won, I guess in the short term. What's going on there?
Well, we saw I think at the beginning of the conflict, the very first thing that ensured that people really believe that this is the beginning of something very long term was when the Ethiopian Federal Forces captured Mekelle, which is the capital city of Tigray. And now it's been recaptured by the TPLF, the TDF, the Tigray Defense Forces, the military wing of the TPLF. And so effective immediately after this, the unilateral ceasefire was announced by the federal forces. So we don't know the impact, of course, this is going to have. It's still unclear. But what's paramount, of course, is the protection of civilians within this process. Of course, with one party entering and another retreating, there will be there's potential for more conflict within, around, and within Mekelle, and of course beyond the region. Mekelle is just one part of Tigray, so that doesn't mean that Tigray has been recaptured. It's just the capital, but the capital is extremely important. So this is a very important development, and we're calling on all parties to respect international humanitarian law and protect civilians' property, equipment. There's been reports, for example, of UNICEF equipment from UNICEF themselves that has been destroyed. So these are the kind of things that we're hoping to avoid and are encouraging all actors to refrain from doing.
Is the implication that the ceasefire means that more humanitarian aid will at least be able to get to the capital, or is the jury still out on that?
The capital is actually not the area where most of the humanitarian assistance has been blocked. Mm-hmm. If you look at the map that the UN kind of puts out in their regular updates from the region, from Tigray, you see there's red, there's orange, red, and white, and Mekelle has actually been the easiest to get aid to so far. It's more of the rural areas that have been difficult because of the different areas that have been controlled by different actors. And so the humanitarian situation, unfortunately, from what we've seen, has been unchanged. And until the conflict ends and until these parties decide to open up access, stop attacking aid workers and their equipment and all those things will continue. So unfortunately, there hasn't been a correlation between the unilateral ceasefire, the recapturing of Mekelle, and the increased humanitarian assistance in Tigray.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Vanessa. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll be able to have you back for some updates shortly.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.